Hi, my name is David Hunter, and I'm a professor of human rights and environmental law here at American University Washington College of Law. It's my pleasure today to be talking about the Human Rights Center here at the AU. What role has the center played in legal education and the promotion and protection of human rights? The center has been extremely important in promoting human rights here in the United States, and particularly in my field of environment and related fields. What I think has been most important about the role, or most interesting about the role, and most unique about the role of the center, is how it's turned its focus on human rights inwardly to the United States. And many of its programs and approaches are looking at how human rights touch and affect the United States. And this work on human rights in the United States is an important expansion of our approach from just thinking about this as civil rights, particularly when it comes to the environment, to my interest in environmental law and the rights to water, rights to a healthy environment. These aren't very well covered that well by civil rights, but they are covered by human rights. And by bringing them into the discussion, we're expanding the discourse in a way that's very important here for the United States and for lending protections to people in vulnerable groups. The center also has been a pioneer in many ways in legal education regarding human rights, particularly with respect to the practice of human rights and giving students an opportunity to participate in human rights processes that aren't controlled and constrained by sometimes the disciplines and constraints of a clinic. It gives students a broader view of how you can work in human rights, how you can work in human rights abroad, but also here in the United States. And it's really the legacy of the center is really the work with students and the number of students and graduates of the center that have gone on to do important and meaningful work, not only in this country and in the Americas, but throughout the world. Literally thousands of students have gone through the center over the years, over the 30 years, have been touched by the center and have had their experiences opened up to the world of human rights and to make it more accessible as a career possibility. In what directions do you see human rights going in the next 30 years? In my field of the environment and environmental protection and its relationship to human rights, we're seeing an explosive growth in this relationship. And I think that growth of the relationship between human rights and the environment, the recognition of it, is going to continue over the next 30 years in new and exciting ways. First, in the United States, we are starting to recognize the link between human rights and the environment. Most of the countries of the world, more than 100, have a human right to a healthy environment or some variant of it in their constitutions. The United States is not one of them, but several of our states do, and we're slowly making the changes to incorporate human rights into our way we think about the environment. I don't think it will come as a constitutional amendment, but I think we'll start to see the laws, the environmental laws, and policies addressing things more from a human rights perspective. As an example, today, and just today, this morning, the Virginia state legislature passed a law creating recognizing a human right to potable water, never before recognized in the state of Virginia and not in very many states in the United States. But we see this as a trend at the state level. And I also think we're going to see this linkage play out more in the courts and in the way we think about environmental law without perhaps naming it human rights and the environment. Right now, environmental law in the United States is managed through its complexity, and it's managed in a way that allows polluters to pollute up to a point where they're permitted. But it doesn't do anything about the legacy pollution, the pollution that's permitted. We're very weak on compensation and on making the polluter pay for the damage that they do that might be legal under our environmental laws. But if we thought of this as in terms of the rights of people not to be contaminated, the rights of people not to have their property contaminated or their bodies contaminated, then we might still do the permitting of environmental pollution, but we would reinforce that with an obligation to pay for the impacts that permitted environmental pollution has on the people that suffer from it. And if we can switch this way of thinking so that, yes, you're allowed to pollute, but you still have to pay for the externalities that you're costing and to the damage that you're doing to people, we'll go a long ways towards dealing with environmental justice and systemic racism in the environmental field, because we'll have to be more conscious of how we're affecting human beings with respect to environmental pollution. And overseas, internationally, we're seeing human rights and the environment really take off. As I mentioned before, more than 100 constitutions around the world have been interpreted or have been rewritten to include a human right to a healthy environment. And we're starting to see a very interesting relationship between environment and human rights. There's a case in the Netherlands called Urgenda, in which essentially the court held that the Dutch government owed their citizens an obligation to take greater steps towards climate change, towards reducing climate change, because of otherwise they would not be protecting their human right to a healthy environment, or really a human right to life. And in this way, and they did this in this court by referencing the Paris Climate Agreement. So they tied the human right to life and interpreted it by reference to the technical scientific findings under the Paris Agreement about how much we have to do as a world to avoid the worst climate change. So in that way, to the human rights lens, the human rights were given some reality, or some, they were given detail and structure and an ability to be applied according to what the science said was necessary to avoid the worst impacts and thus the violations of human rights that would be led from climate change. And at the same time, the climate change regime, the Paris Agreement, which is woefully lacking in any kind of enforcement mechanism, can now start to rely on the human rights regime as a way of enforcing climate change and environmental law. And I believe we'll see that over the next few decades. We're already seeing more cases in this vein where human right to a healthy environment, or human right to life, or to the quiet enjoyment of property is being interpreted as by reference to the science regarding what countries have to do to avoid climate change, and rooting human rights in the science, thus giving contours and limits and bounds, but also clarity to human right to the environment, or human rights to live in a world with a stable climate. We're seeing some of this rhetoric show up in US cases, although no United States cases have been decided that way yet. But I think in the future, we'll see not only more cases around climate change, but also around water, and perhaps even the protection of biological diversity and other ecosystem services. And in this way, human rights will be able to enforce environmental standards and give some strength to the environmental regimes, while at the same time, the environmental regimes give some clarity to the human rights regimes. And I think this marriage between human rights and the environment is just beginning, and will be a very exciting area to practice coming up in the next few decades. And I hope that the center will be engaged in this and right in the middle of it. What advice do I have for students? Well, to be a good human rights and environment lawyer, or to be a good human rights lawyer, or to be a good international environmental lawyer, you have to first be a good lawyer. You then have to be a good environmental lawyer, and a good international lawyer, and a good human rights lawyer, which is to say that to practice in these fields today, you need to have a breadth of understanding of law in its many disciplines. don't think one should specialize so much that you aren't able to bring some knowledge and experience in from other fields of law into your practice of human rights. Having said that, I think it's also important to get experience early in working with human rights and to get a good founding and grounding in human rights law, but to recognize that the breadth of bringing other disciplines in is critical generally, but also even more critical when we think about how human rights and environment, or human rights and trade, or human rights and water, or whatever it is, how human rights touch now on so many aspects of the economy, business and human rights. And to be able to be successful in those fields, you need to have some grounding in those areas of law as well. So the bad news is, human rights lawyers, you're going to have to learn some taxation and business law perhaps as well, but that's okay. Thank you.